I'm just curious about whether or not you think that there's potential or if there is already evidence blogging communities that cross borders, because we've spoken about communities that are based in countries of bloggers, and I'm quite interested in whether or not those communities connect up with either each other or with people in their region to coordinate campaigning.
Yeah. I think the idea of kind of bridge building blogging or just bridge building online is happening slowly. And generally speaking, a good example is there's a group called Global Voices which started at Harvard a number of years ago. Some of you may know. It basically either translates bloggers from not every country around the world, but most of them, and talks about issues often written by people in country about the issues which are relevant to them. What Global Voices has done in the last couple of years is trying to find connections between different communities in different countries. So they have a program which is called Rising Voices, which they started about a year ago, and that essentially is providing funding to groups in countries who are not middle class bloggers, who basically may be, for example, we're talking about sex workers in India, for example, who are clearly, you wouldn't think the first thing you have to go online and blog about their experiences, right? But there is a sense of empowering people like that to have a voice, for one, and then connecting them maybe to people in similar situations in other countries. That sort of thing is starting. I think there, as you rightly say, there has somehow been too much of a sort of siloing effect of, this country, that country, and that's true. I think there is sometimes a sense, though, in many of the countries that I went to, and others as well, that making that connection to other countries has not been that easy. Not because people aren't interested. I think it's partly a sense of it's still a relatively new phenomenon. Like, people often forget that 10 years ago, virtually the web, most of us, wasn't really an issue. I mean, it existed, right? But it wasn't really around. So things are moving very, very quickly. So the Rising Voices project is one. There's also a really interesting example of, which I've read in the last few months, of countries that are suffering in Latin America, especially from hurricanes. As we're saying at the moment, Hurricane Gustav going through the States, but who are kind of hooking up and helping each other on tips of how to deal with these sort of things, right? That sort of thing. I mean, generally speaking, America, although Katrina sort of proved that wrong, but generally speaking, first world countries deal with this better than third world countries, generally. Although Katrina said proved that wrong, but generally speaking. But a country like Cuba or other countries where clearly if a hurricane comes, their countries seem to be pretty screwed because they haven't got the resources to do it. So there's an increasing discussion between bloggers and online groups in different countries which are affected by that in the developing world, talking about those kind of issues. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. I mean, I guess the answer is also it is happening more and more, and I think that should be encouraged to happen more and more, and I think we can certainly help that along. I mean, I'm really conscious of this concept of kind of Western meddling. I mean, putting people in touch is not meddling, but the idea of facilitating and listening and providing assistance rather than telling people how it's done. I was at this Global Voices conference a few months ago in Hungary, and this sort of issue came up a lot, that there's a real danger of the West generally telling people how things should be. I mean, all of us go through that issue the whole time, the human rights issue. I'm sure you guys are having to deal with it all the time. It's a very sensitive issue. There's a fine line between helping people and telling them, this is how things should be. And I guess when it comes to blogging or online media, I think the best thing that we can do is actually giving people assistance about what the web could do for their own communities, which is a good start. And often that's people in communities that are poor or minorities, and that's happening across Latin America as well. It's an interesting campaign I saw recently about minorities in Bolivia. The country's dirt poor, it remains dirt poor, but it's not going to probably change for a while, but there has been the beginnings of a campaign to assist poor people to actually get online and actually, their whole life is not about using the internet, and their lives are getting food on the table and having a roof over their head, but there's a sense that these communities are able to connect with other like-minded communities in other parts of Latin America, say, or they can just actually get online and realise that they can feel empowered just by telling their stories. There's the idea of actually someone telling their story and someone in, Washington or Caracas actually reading what they have to say. That in itself, for people who I was seeing in Budapest a few months ago, that was an incredibly empowering experience for me. Just being read, just being heard, apart from their own friends, just hearing that. And the web do that in amazing ways. And using, whether it's YouTube or social networking sites, that kind of thing. So it's happening slowly.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Do you think it's justified for governments to censor blogs that promote terrorism and extremism?
You can see that question. This is about, is it justified for governments to ban websites? Are you saying promote terrorism or support terrorism?
Yeah, both.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I think the answer to that is, generally speaking, who defines what terrorism is? Now, if there's a sense, and this is what's happening increasingly in Western countries, that, for example, in the West, say, Hamas, the Palestinian group, is regarded as a terrorist group. Now, in many Western countries, as we've seen this even recently in Australia, if you are seen as supporting Hamas, that's a problem, and the government may come knock on your door. Now, to me, without wishing to go into detail, Hamas has committed terrorist acts, there's no doubt. I don't see Hamas as a terrorist organisation, for example. Now, if the government comes out tomorrow and says, I couldn't access the Hamas website, not that I ever do, but let's say I wanted to, that to me would be a problem. I think there should be a right to actually look at information that I want to look at. Now, the next question, logical question, would be that there's no doubt that one of the great successes, if you call it that, of the Al-Qaeda network and the Islamist movement in the last 8 years since 9/11, its actual recruits have declined in some ways on one level, but in terms of its online presence is massive. It's massive and growing. And I think the idea of, for example, banning a website that tells you how to build a bomb, on one level you sort of say, how can that be useful for anybody apart from causing damage? Yes. I suppose I generally err on the side of no censorship at all. That's just a personal thing. Many people disagree with that view. Because I just don't trust governments to make that decision for me. I don't. I think governments' natural reaction is always to ban more than they should. Now, the next question you might have would be, how about child pornography? Which is an often logical next question. Well, it's hideous and it's a problem. Now, should it be banned? Maybe. I don't know. I haven't got an answer to that. I don't know. I mean, the Rudd government came in talking about implementing a filtering process for pornographic websites to work in conjunction with ISPs to ban sites that were deemed to be inappropriate. Now, I don't doubt that many of the sites that the Rudd government will probably end up banning are hideous. I don't doubt that for a second. But what I worry about is there's not going to be a transparency about what sites are being blocked and why. Now, I've got no issue with sites the average person can't access about child porn. That's not a problem. But as I said, to me, I fear that many governments will then move that into let's ban sites about terrorism as well. And again, to me, it's about how do we define what terrorism is. And generally speaking, in the last 8 years, when it comes to, say, the Anglosphere's view about terrorism, I think it's actually made the situation far worse and far better. It's exacerbated the problem rather than helped it. So I haven't got a strict answer to that, but I generally am sceptical of governments who say that we should ban websites that promote terrorism. Because often there could be sites that are critical of the US as well, or critical of the West.